Hello and welcome to the Oxygen Addict podcast. We're brought to you every week by our sponsors, precisionfuelandhydration.com. You can personalize your fueling and hydration strategy so you can perform at your best with 15% off your first order of electrolytes and carbohydrate fuel with the code OA23, precisionfuelandhydration.com. Welcome to the show, everybody. I'm your host, Coach Rob Wilby, and I'm joined by Coach Chris Palfreman. Welcome, Chris. How are you today?
Hey, Rob. Hello, everyone. Good to hear your voice as always.
You too, mate. Every week we try and bring you an episode of this podcast to motivate you, to inspire you, to hopefully give you a ton of information to help you get through your Ironman upcoming events. You can do a couple of things for us before we kick off, actually. If you're on YouTube, if you can like and subscribe this episode, that would really, really help us out. Subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening on the podcast, click follow on your podcast player. And also, if you're looking for help and advice with your endurance training, you can get in contact with us. You can write to us at help@oxygenaddict.com, or there's a link in the show notes. You can book a call with us and we'll talk more about that later on, Chris. We're having quite a few people at the moment sending the equivalent of the bat signal up saying, got an Ironman coming and I need some help.
Yeah, we're at that interesting time in the season where either you've had a really good winter and you're really excited about, your big event in the summer, or you're thinking, oh my God, I've got a big event in the summer and training hasn't quite gone to plan. What do I do next?
That's the big open secret, isn't it, of coaching, is that everyone assumes people have coaches because things go really well all the time. The reality is it's to help when things aren't going so well that people have coaches. So if you're listening and that's you, drop us a line. We'll do what we can to help you out, whether that's taking you on as an athlete or whether that's just giving you the arm around the shoulder that you need to hear right here. So drop us a note in the comments if that sounds like you. All right, on this week's episode, we're going to focus today on the 12-week run-in to your Ironman. There's lots of people have been dropping us a line saying, look, I've got this Ironman coming up this summer. Can you help me out? Sketch out for me. What should the last 12-week run-in look like? What should a recovery week look like? I've heard you talk about a down week, but I don't really know what to do other than do a bit less training. In more general terms, people have got themselves pretty fit to this point, and they're looking at the last 12 weeks and thinking, right, it tends to be, doesn't it? This is where the rubber really meets the road and people really start thinking, okay, 12 weeks to go. I'm going to really focus in on what I'm doing now. So that's going to be the focus of this show.
I think that's bang on, Rob. I also think that this is the period where if you get it right, it makes a massive difference come race day. But if you get it wrong by starting to cram things a little bit too early, you've had a week of illness or a family holiday and suddenly you think, right, I've lost that. How do I make up for it? Then suddenly there are negative knock-on effects. So you've got to be quite wise at this stage and not panic and essentially stick to the plan and believe in the plan, whatever that plan may be. As long as there's logic to it, usually that will get you there.
Yeah, you're dead right. And for people listening for whom things may not be going exactly to plan right now, know that it's also not going to plan for almost everybody else listening. I think we live in this little bubble where we think things aren't going well for me, but for everybody else, things are fantastic. And the reality is most people are struggling to fit things in most of the time. And if we can give people the one piece of advice, it's not cramming more in, it's looking at what you can remove from your week in order to recover from the training that you can do. Before we kick off, Chris, I'm going to give a shout out to our sponsor of today's episode, Precision Fuel and Hydration. If you head over to their website, you can use the free fuel and hydration planning tool to receive a personalized strategy for your next race. The plan will help you understand sort of how many grams of carbohydrate per hour you need, how much fluid you need, how many grams of sodium per hour you need, or milligrams of sodium per hour you need for you, for your body type, for the event you're doing, and also for the weather conditions. And as we move towards racing in the summertime, for a lot of people, often things change and you need more sodium, or you find you need more carbs, or you find you need much more fluid than you needed on a cold ride in the wintertime. Their website's got this great planning tool you can use that gives you a really great lead. You can even book a free one-to-one video consultation with their team who will really help you out in 20 minutes, understanding what you need to do for your race. So there's a link in the show notes you can click. They'll be really happy to nail your race nutrition plan. And also, if you just click the link there, remember you can use the code OA23 for 15% your first order. Off your first order of electrolytes and carbohydrate fuel over at precisionfuelandhydration.com. Chris, I've just got off the turbo and I don't mind telling you, I was going for a few of those Precision Fuel and Hydration chewy the jelly, chewy, num things. Yeah.
I know the ones, yeah.
Had to hide the bag from my son so he can't get at them. Hide them high in the cupboard. That's the key. But yeah, it goes down very nice. A little treat there to get you on the turbo, isn't it? Oh, let's jump into it. Let's jump into today's show then. So we're focusing on the last 3 months before your Ironman and the things that you can do, the way you can structure your training in this time. And if you're already training with us and your structure's really well, or your training is really well structured, other things you can take care of along the way in the last 3 months. So let's jump right into it, Chris.
I think just going off what you just said, if we reference the athletes that we're working with, they've got plans that are very specific for their A, B, and maybe even C race within the year.
Yeah.
And as coaches, all we really want to see is the most consistency that they can bring to that plan. So week on week, can they hit those sessions, not just ticking the box green, but also sticking to prescribed intensities, and more often than not going over the zones that we ask for, which this is the interesting time because the athletes that we're working with, the majority of them have had really solid winters, and we've seen that from going through the Training Peaks accounts that we have access to. And so physically, they're able to do an enormous amount of volume week after week. And so the athlete's mind starts to think, well, maybe I see a 3-hour ride on a Saturday or Sunday. I'm fit enough to do 4, 5, or 6 hours. That's probably better for me at this stage because I'm fit enough. And so this is the kind of balancing act that we as coaches and the athletes that we work with really have to find that middle ground. Because yes, you are fit, but we don't want you too fit too early, or we don't want you too fatigued at the wrong time. And so there's this balancing act where you come out of winter, the weather's much easier to train in, you've got more daylight, and your body is telling you, I can cope with everything I can see in the plan. I'm getting more and more consistent. Therefore, Coach Rob, Coach Chris, give me more. And that's not always the answer, is it, Rob?
Ever. That's not ever the answer. Yeah, someone asked me a while ago, what the ideal build-up to an Ironman be? If I had all the time in the world, what would the ideal build-up look like? And it would be, well, just give me 150 weeks and then we'll talk. 150 weeks of doing what you've been asked on the training plan, getting it all done, but no more, not getting yourself sick, not overstretching yourself, not deciding to do a harder session, a faster session. 150 weeks of that, and then we'll talk about, living the pro athlete dream. Because it's the overall consistency of that training. And we've said this often before. I remember coaching a guy in the early days who went away with a mate, and they racked up 41 hours of training in a week in the Canaries. And I was absolutely staggered by it. But that's pretty much all they did that year, because they were so ruined when they got back, bless them, that it took them 2.5, 3 weeks to recover of doing almost nothing. So again, just getting your volume of training done. And the way we'll describe this today for people who are not coached by us, we'll talk through a sort of a build of what training should look like on a week-by-week basis. But that will get you fit enough to have a really good performance on race day. There's no need to be doing more. And there's a lot to be gained, I think, by not listening to the voice in an athlete's head that says, I could do more right now. Because the question is more accurately asked as, will I be able to do what's asked of me tomorrow, next week? And if you do what's asked of you today, then the answer is going to be yes. If you do more or less or harder, the answer is possibly not going to be yes. So let's control the controllables.
Really good point. I think it's kind of the sport that we're in, because it's such a daunting one, especially when you're looking at middle distance and long distance. It's kind of crazy what we're asking ourselves to do in 3 months' time. So I think every time that you deviate from a plan that you believed in originally at the start of the year, every time you deviate from that, I feel that it's a form of panic training. It's the irrational in us that we're kind of telling ourselves, I need to be running more, running faster, doing more races. And actually, if you can take that emotion out of it and look, if you've got the luxury of seeing a few weeks ahead in your plan, look ahead and try and imagine the fatigue that you'll be in 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks' time. And just because you feel great today doesn't mean that you're not going to feel the effects of endurance training in 2 or 3 weeks' time. So, it's a patience game. Like race day, you have to strategically pace yourself throughout a 4, 5, 8, 9, 10-hour day. But it's the same in training as well. We've got to pace ourselves to make sure that come race day, we're firing on all cylinders, mentally and physically, and we've got a lot of things to balance. So yeah, patience is going to be really required, I think.
And people can look at this as an exercise in discipline. On race day, you're going to need discipline to stick to the power heart rate zones you're going to ride at, because it's going to feel really easy for the first 3 hours of the bike if you get it right. And you're going to be tempted to go harder. You need to develop discipline as though it's a muscle by taking every opportunity you've got to not be driven by obsession or compulsion, to not want to do more or to not want to do harder because you can, to not add extra in because you've got a 3 hour at lunchtime all of a sudden. That discipline, I think, can be built over time and is then cashed in on race day. For an athlete who's just done whatever they wanted and whatever they felt like and whatever they were worried about the whole way through the training plan, guess what? When that guy or girl comes by you on the bike on race day, you're going to chase after them because you haven't learned to say no to that voice that goes, hey, we could do that right now. Well, yeah, we could, but should we? That's the question, I think.
Totally. So in terms of training structures within a training block, so we kind of, the athletes that we're talking to are the ones that are racing in the summer in 3 months' time. We're assuming that the majority of those have had a consistent enough winter block where they're actually going to be able to cope with the slightly different stimulus in training that a kind of build phase of training requires. So is that the kind of athlete that you want to be talking
Yeah,
to?
I think the thing we'll do is we'll talk to two kinds of athletes. We've got athletes that we coach, or athletes like the ones we coach who've been following a really structured plan. And to give you a context here, guys on our standard plan, if you like, about 12 weeks out from race day, will be at the point where they're comfortable riding 4 hours and running about 2 hours in training. And then I recognize that not everybody's like that. We've got athletes who are listening who are not following a plan particularly, or are just doing training when they can. And that's fine. We've all been there. It's the just get me through this athletes. If you are in some kind of swim and run and bike shape at the moment, 12 weeks is enough, hopefully, to get you through an Ironman. If you're riding for a couple of hours and you're running for, I don't know, an hour or 75 minutes now, you can probably just about get yourself to the point you can get round an Ironman. And we've got to remember, for lots of people, that's it. That's their lifelong dream, to just get themselves around an Ironman. It's not about performance, it's about crossing that finish line. So for those athletes, we can talk them through the structure, but I would still advise, like, if you're 12 weeks out and you can't comfortably ride your bike for over a couple of hours, you can't comfortably run for an hour, it'd be worth considering at this point, would you be better off served delaying this event to another year? Would you be better off served pushing it back further in the year? Because, time's getting pretty tight in order to make the kind of sensible progress you need to every week. We'll talk through what that looks like in a minute. But what we don't want is somebody kind of turning themselves inside out for 3 or 4 weeks and then getting injured, or jumping from 2 hours to 4.5 hours on the bike, or an hour to 2 hours on the run and getting problems. We're talking about doing it safely, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. And I think for those athletes that are doubting whether they're going to be in shape to be able to complete an Ironman, I'm not talking about performance, but just getting from A to B. Please, if you're listening to this and you're in that position because you've had a difficult winter, please don't go and test yourself this weekend or in a few weeks and see how far you can go. And I've seen it many times where they're doubting themselves whether they can do it or not. So they think, oh, I'll go and run a 2 hour run, or I'll go and ride 4 hours and do a 2 hour brick to see if I'm even capable of stomaching that. And that's just the sure way to either burn out or cause a pretty big injury. So please don't do that. The way that you're going to make the decision whether you're going to be okay in 12 weeks or not is look what you've done historically. Look at your past few months, not this massive weekend that you're just going to set up. And so, yeah, I've seen it too many times, and it never brings fruit. It never does.
Yeah. And again, the context here is what we're really trying to do is help people avoid making decisions that are likely going to lead to medium or long-term pain. So getting injured, doing something that means that you're trying to carry an injury on race day. There's going to come a point, I think, for some people where the honest answer is, look, it isn't the right decision to make for you to try and go ahead and do this year, because you can't get yourself there safely right now. It's not to say people aren't going to ignore me and think they're going to sort of prove it wrong in a way, but I'd rather see people do it further down the line and get there more comfortably. I think that's the way to look at it, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And look for multiple years. Don't just, hopefully, if you're listening to this, you're really into endurance sport and into triathlon, and, doing it for 1 year kind of on a hack and doing some massive volume 1 week and nothing the next week, you're not going to have a great race experience. And we'd much rather see longevity within the sport and allow your body to adapt over time. And the experience is vastly different. And you can get something very, very positive out of doing a strong Ironman because you did logical training in the lead up.
Yeah, 100%. For athletes who are following structured plans at the moment, and in fact, for all athletes, I'm going to say this, I think 12 weeks out from race day is a good point to talk about doing an outdoor FTP test. Lots of athletes have spent time training indoors on the trainer on the winter. I think it's really appropriate now to say, for some people, your numbers are going to be the same indoors and outdoors, and that's great. For some people, are going to be miles out in either direction. So you're either putting out much more power or much less power in whatever bike position you're in outdoors. So now, 12 or so weeks away from race day is a really important time to go out and just get a handle on what your numbers are. And then you know what your zones are accurate to what you're capable of outdoors. So don't work to just your indoor numbers. Again, if you're on a different bike or a different power meter outdoors, it's really important to get that number accurate. And then you can be really sure that what you think of as 70% of your FTP, for example, is in fact 70% of your real outdoor FTP. Don't do the test outdoors on a hill. That's another tip for you. Get it done on a flat piece of land, and that will give you a really good feel for what you're capable of outdoors. So that kind of goes for everyone. If you don't have a power meter and you're training just with heart rate, similarly do that outside with your heart rate monitor on, and then you can set your heart rate zones up. They probably won't be very different to the indoor numbers unless you've been extremely hot when you've been doing your indoor sessions, which, can be the case for some people without fans. So sometimes there is that difference in what the number is outdoors. Doesn't mean it's changed necessarily indoors to outdoors, but it might read differently, and that's the important thing.
Yeah, I've seen quite a few people's test results come in on their first outdoor FTP test, and I think there is some learning there. And one of the points is that obviously you've mentioned bikes. So a lot of people train on their either road bike indoors and then they go onto their TT race bike outdoors, and their number outdoors is going to be lower than indoors. And psychologically, we might be thinking, I've put in all this work for FTP and I'm not seeing any gain, I'm seeing a loss, how frustrating. But there are more metrics that you can keep an eye on. So you've got to see how your heart rate is in correlation to that. So maybe you had a lower heart rate and your FTP was lower or higher, but there are lots of different things going on. Was your cadence different? Usually it is from indoor to outdoor because of all the external factors. Your power meter might be different as well, so keep an eye on that. That's another anomaly. But the one that I think is the main one is the fact that you may have not ridden this bike for many months on end. So if that bike has just been gathering dust, you're asking a lot of your body to suddenly get into a very aero position and hold an extremely high number for 20 minutes. So if you've got the luxury of time, try and head out on that bike for a few easy rides beforehand to get kind of feeling at home on that bike again, because it does take time. And for us to ask you to go and do, maximal effort on this essentially a new bike, it feels very alien. So if you can start to make that TT bike feel like home again before you ask yourself to put in a maximal effort, then I think the numbers that you're going to get out of it are much more representative to the engine that you're actually able to produce. So yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it?
100% agree with that. It's very tempting, I think, to get the TT bike out, to go outdoors on it and do the test on your first ride outdoors, but you're much better off having 2 or 3 rides under your belt and just getting used to that position again before you go and do that. I think it's interesting. The outdoor FTP test is one that people go into and they're dreading it. And it's a very different experience outdoors, I find, than it is indoors. The indoor FTP experience on a turbo trainer can be pretty gruesome, can't it? 20 minutes on your own in the heat. There's a lot more going on in an outdoor test outdoors. And we've advised our athletes to go and do a 10-mile time trial if they can enter one and go and do that. They come back from it very often saying, do you know what? That was really good. I really, really enjoyed that. That's great. So there is no problem with doing more of those kind of rides outdoors. I think it's worth remembering you can recover from an FTP test outdoors or a 10-mile time trial outdoors. Usually you're recovered in 24 hours. It's not like a week-ending effort, which it can sometimes feel like. I think during the winter on the turbo trainer, it can be built up to be something in people's heads that it doesn't really need to be.
Yeah, I also think the ability to ride the road is really important. And what I mean by that is not just having this one metric to have the highest normalized power, average power for 20 minutes, but also, did you ride it safely? Did you ride it in a progressive way of how your heart rate was fluctuating or not compared to power? Because if you go really hard in the first 5 minutes because you're on a slight incline, or you've gone straight off a roundabout and you increase in power, big spike, you've actually got to learn how to corner, you've got to learn how to hold that position. You've got to be, it's all about efficiency. And we were talking about this in the winter, that all these sessions that we're giving our athletes to build this really big aerobic engine, but it's also about fueling efficiency and how your body can kind of respond to the demands that we're asking it to. And you've got to be able to translate all that fitness into efficiency and speed once on the road. So actually, I've had it in the past where I've done an outdoor FTP and my number was quite a bit below what I've been producing indoors, and it's really frustrating. But then I look at the speed that was translated, and the speed was really high. And so if I look at the kind of overall package of what I've just done, is I'm producing less numbers, which is easier for my body to cope with over prolonged hours, and my speed is higher than I would have thought. So that's exactly what we're looking for. All this training is paying off, because come race day, I'm able to work at a slightly lower power output, but more efficient because I'm more aero than I previously was. My cadence is really smooth and predictable. And so my heart rate is smooth and predictable over X amount of hours. And that's essentially what we're looking to do. We're not looking to be that 20-minute specialist and being at threshold or above. We're looking to be really good over numerous amount of hours on end. So don't be too disheartened if you see a lower FTP than you think on the road, because it's totally normal. And many professionals at the highest level will have a lower FTP, and that's okay.
Yeah, 100%. Right, then let's have a little chat. I think next point is how to safely increase the duration of long runs and long rides over the coming sort of period of time. And a really good rough rule of thumb here is somewhere in the region of 30 minutes on the bike longer than your previous week's long ride, somewhere in the region of 15 minutes longer long run than your previous long run is about the ballpark that we think is a safe increase. There are some exceptions to that with athletes with multiple years of training history. But if you want to sketch out, as we talked earlier, a training plan that you see consistent returns from and you can tick those weeks off, I think the 30-minute increase each week in the bike and the 15-minute increase in the run is a really good one. Now, with the athletes we mentioned before that we coach, if they're already at 4 hours on the bike and 2 hours on the run, we've got loads of time to get them to 6 hours on the bike and 3 hours on the run. If it's an athlete who's listening, who is maybe only a couple of hours on the bike and an hour on the run, you've not left yourself a lot of wiggle room to get there, but it is still possible. But I really would advise these athletes to not be tempted to think, right, I feel pretty good on this run today, I'm going to add a little bit more on. I think everyone's done that. I've got to the 75 minutes. I'm going to do a bit more and get to 85 minutes. Just stick to your numbers. And if you increase by 3 weeks worth of increasing in those chunks and then have a 4th week as a recovery week, you're then going to find yourself in a good position to start again. So with our athlete who is maybe, say, starting at 2 hours, they'll go 2, 2.5, 3, have a recovery week where they do about half that. So drop down to 90 minutes. And then they can go 3.5, 4, 4.5, 90 minutes, 5, 5.5, 6. And there we go. We're at the 6-hour mark for getting through an Ironman. And those are the numbers that we're aiming for. Even if athletes are going to be out on the road significantly longer on race day than 6 hours on the bike and 3 hours on the run, certainly on the run, I'd advise nobody to be out there running for longer than 3 hours in training, because it's just going to take you too long to recover from that long run. if you are an athlete who knows they're going to be out for 5-6 hours on the marathon come race day, what I'd advise you do is every other week, swap in that long run for a really long hike. Go out and get lots of time in on your feet and get used to the idea of walking for a long period of time. And the key to this is actually to not sit down while you're out. Now, I remember years ago, Chris, my physiology professor doing a seminar on marathon running, and he started by defining the scale of the challenge. And the first thing he said was, most people who attempt the London Marathon have never just stood up on their feet for the period of time that they're going to try and run for. And then we realize, we wonder why people can't get through the race. And I thought that and thought, when was the last time I stood up for 3 hours? I mean, probably never, right? Without a little break. If someone's going to be out there for 6 hours on Ironman race day, it's a long time to be on your feet for, and you can condition yourself and prepare yourself for it without even necessarily needing to be out for a run.
And I think this is something that long distance triathletes could learn from the ultra running community. In the ultra running community, always seem to be talking about time on feet, which was something that was quite new to me. I always worked on distance or pace or running time, but never just time on feet. And so the more that I've delved into the ultra community, they're essentially logging the amount of times that they're on their feet. And that might be a 2-hour run walk that they do in the morning, but then in the afternoon that might be another 2 hours of just hiking or walking, and that does count as their training. Whereas in my triathlete days, I would have never called 2 hours of walking part of their training. But it's all about time on feet and teaching the body to be robust enough to be hour after hour after hour okay, which is something that I think the triathlon community could maybe learn a little bit from, and valuing the essential concept of time on feet.
Yeah. And it's also something that allows you to, we take a typical family person who gets up early to do their long run and then has to play mum or dad taxi for the rest of the day and stand around watching netball or hockey or football at the weekends. Guess what? That just became part of your training, became something that you don't sort of resent because you're tired and you want to be having a lie down on the sofa. It becomes an extra part of your training. So there's a little mental skill there, I think, as well, in adding that into your training time.
There's something comes to mind, Rob, is you just mentioned what an athlete that is maybe going to be on their feet for many hours during the marathon on race day. What would you say to the athlete that is chasing less hours? So let's call it those chasing an ambitious 3 hours on a Ironman run. You kind of mentioned that no one should be running over 3 hours in training. What would you say to those that are aiming for a really quick marathon around the 3-hour mark?
I would still go with that being the maximum distance of the run, and that's the key to it. Even if it's going to be a person who's running a 2:40 marathon on race day, I think the 3-hour run is a really key benchmark to get to on the way to their Ironman marathon, because it's something that's going to add to their endurance and capacity along the way, I think.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. Should we jump forward and we'll have a look at the strategies for recovery?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we talk a lot about training, but we don't ever talk about recovery. That's interesting, isn't it? You don't go online and buy a recovery plan. You don't buy a book on recovering. And yet that's when we're going to get all of our fitness gains. Now, that's an interesting conundrum that athletes face. I almost never have an athlete ask me how they can recover from their training session better. I almost never have them say to me, well, I've got this extra time. I was thinking I might look at better ways I can recover from my training. The question is almost always, what other training should I be doing? And you quickly get to the point where you realize that left to your own device, maybe an athlete would think about training 24 hours a day if they had 24 hours a day to train, right?
I'd like to think this is something that is changing. I think it's going to be really slow to change, but I think the narrative around the recovery periods and the necessary time that needs to be built into a training plan on recovery is going to be. And I think you're absolutely right. The athlete that trains the most is the one that's the fastest or the strongest on race day. Used to be, that's certainly what I grew up on. Whoever's training the hardest and the most is the ultimate athlete and they're the one who are going to win the race. Slowly but surely, I think we've seen a shift that actually it's the athlete that is the most intelligent in training for the longest period of time, and how they balance their stresses and then their recovery time are the ones that are going to be healthiest and fastest on race day. But it's slowly but surely we're starting to track that in the endurance world, whether it's through heart rate variability and all these different metrics that athletes use. And it's one that, and I don't know whether it's because I've been through that process myself, but I have definitely put more focus on recovery. And when I see in my plan a kind of an easy Saturday, which I might find really frustrating, because Saturday is a day that, you know, in terms of family stuff, it's okay, I can do some training. And if I only see half an hour run and strength and conditioning, that's going to feel like a wasted training day. But it's not. That's the ultimate day to recover from the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday that did have some big sessions in. And then I need to recover and tick over on Saturday to set me up for Sunday and maybe Monday. And so we put too much kind of emphasis on the training and not enough on the recovery, which completely skews the benefits that we're going to get from it. And I think it's a lot easier as a coach to see where someone else is going wrong. Whereas when it's our own kind of training and output that we want to see at the end of the season, we just want to see more. And what we mean by more is more training. But actually, that's where things unravel.
Yeah.
So what's your advice on that, Rob? How can we do it?
Well, look, I think the key time when we're going to recover from our training is sleeping. And so the first question an athlete should be asking themselves is, am I getting enough sleep? Can I get more sleep? That is the easiest and simplest. Your body releases the kind of drugs that bodybuilders inject themselves with during the time that you're asleep. And so it's almost it's like thinking itself as a free hit of illegal drugs, isn't it? If you can get an hour's nap in during the day, or you can get an extra hour of sleep at night, that's the first place I would go to with an athlete who says they've got more time and wants to do more training. It's, well, are you getting 8 hours of sleep? And it's been proven, I think, that if you get less than 6 hours, you're as impaired. I might have this fact wrong. It might be less than 5 hours, but you're as impaired as if you were over the limit to drink with alcohol. So we've got to assume that our body's not recovering from training if we're having such short amount of sleep. And so that's worth flagging for an athlete who has to cut sleep in order to be able to fit training in. If you're not getting a minimum of 6 and ideally 8 hours of sleep, you've got to be really careful before you try and add in any training, let alone more training, if it's coming at the expense of sleep. I think it's similar with fueling during and after sessions as well. That's a really simple but often very overlooked thing, in that you've got to go in any Facebook group and read about some random internet keyboard warrior talking about, I got up and I had a fasted training session. That's not fasted. You just haven't had anything to eat yet. There's a big difference there, right? We've got to learn to fuel our bodies for the exercise, because our bodies during Ironman in particular are going to have to learn to basically process calories the entire day when you're out there. There's not going to be a moment it isn't trying to ingest carbohydrate during the whole day. So you have to practice in training. It's a very different mindset to the rest of the year, when we might be in like, well, I'll do the training and then maybe I'll get a little bit leaner. It's not that at all.
I think what you touched on in terms of sleep is really important. And, you know, nowadays there's lots of technology that can help us, whether it's through Aura Ring or equivalent. But actually, going back to, you know, the principles of listening to your body, I feel that if as an athlete you wake up and you're tired too many days in a row, so that could be 3 or 4 days in a row where you're kind of lethargic when you wake up and you think, oh my God, another day, another session, I don't know if I can do this, then the likelihood is that you're training to the point where you're not recovering. So then that's when it needs to all be rebalanced. And I think if you do that week after week after week, come race day, the likelihood of you being energized, excited, and ready to go is quite low. So I think on a weekly basis, even without the kind of help of technology, an athlete can self-assess and think, am I tired too many days in a row? If that's the case, just press pause and integrate a day of recovery. And that can be a light dog walk. It can be a very, very light swim if you keep wanting to be active, or better than nothing, do nothing, and that is absolutely brilliant recovery. So I don't really, I mean, one thing that I really don't like seeing is an athlete's narrative being, I'm doing all this Ironman training, I'm absolutely shattered the whole time, I've got stress at home, stress at work, and I'm just doing these 9-10 p.m. runs or bikes, and then I wake up at 5 a.m. and I go for another run. And I'm afraid that occasionally that's okay, and there'll be key times where you really need to get that volume in, but the majority of the time you shouldn't be feeling like you're on this never-ending treadmill of fatigue, and then more training, then fatigue, then more training. You have to have that dip in training to make sure that you can absorb all the stresses that we've asked your body to go through. And it's really hard to do, because we're scared of the event we're doing, and we all are. We're all scared of an Ironman, and everyone should be, whether you're right at the front of the race or at the back. Everyone's scared of that distance for good reason, but that doesn't mean that you have to train more when you're fatigued. It means you have to listen to your body and train more at the right times when you're energized to do so. But at other times, you have to press pause.
Yeah. Sleep first. I think that's got to be the overall narrative for most people. If you're going to plan to get up really early for a swim, plan to go really early to bed the night before, so that you can in fact get that 6, 7, 8 hours of sleep in before the swim. And for some people, if they're swimming at 5, it's going to mean being asleep by 9. It's a tough ask for a lot of people. And if I put my hand on my heart, I know now that my magic number for sleep is a minimum of 7 hours a night. Yet when I was training, I wouldn't have admitted that. The minimum amount of sleep I needed was whatever was necessary to get to the pool or get on the ride first thing in the morning. So it's being honest about the science, and the facts say you need that sleep to recover. Don't deny it yourself. I think that's the way, isn't it?
Totally.
Okay, next up then, let's talk about the importance of fueling, hydration, and electrolytes as race day gets closer. It's really important to stress this in the final 12 weeks. We're entering a new phase here, and the phase that we are in is now you are training your body to absorb carbohydrate whilst you are exercising. That's all there is to it. If you take some simple numbers here, I was on the turbo earlier, 600 calories burnt in an hour, but I can't absorb more than about 300 calories worth of carbohydrate per hour, even if I eat 300 calories of carbohydrate in the hour. So there's going to be a gradual depletion of my carbohydrate stores across the event. You can't afford to not be feeding yourself, and you can't afford to not be training yourself to feed yourself during training. That's the thing. So really simple rule of thumb. You need a gram of carbohydrate per kilo of body weight of carbohydrate per hour of exercise. So rough rule of thumb, 60 kilo person needs 60 grams, an 80 kilo person needs 80 grams. Use that as a starting point and go away and experiment with it. Often, bigger athletes and faster athletes and athletes who are further down their athletic journey find they can absorb progressively more as time goes by. But you have to start under your limit and work up to it, because if you just cram in loads and loads and loads, I've had lots of experiences of athletes who've unfortunately started trying to run with a stomach full of undigested chewy bars and gels, and it's very unpleasant for them on race day. So find the number that works for you.
I think there are two kind of stages to this. It's one, physically being able to actually consume that amount of carbohydrate, which is hard enough in itself when you're on a 3 or 5 hour ride. But then there's a whole other stage that we're not so aware of, which is your body actually able to process and absorb that and send it around to the body as needed? And that's something that's not quite tangible, because we think if we throw in 90 grams of carbs, we think that the body's going to be able to absorb that the first time we do it, but it's not the case usually. And you can, as Rob, you just said, you usually find that out in a really bad way on a really long run, and once that's happened, it's very hard to come back from it, and it leaves a sour taste in the mouth, literally. So if you're able to kind of drip feed that process into your training, and you'll be able to look ahead, and if you've got longer rides coming up, longer run coming up, that's the perfect time to start making mental notes yourself of, I consumed 60 grams of carbs, but actually how I felt did not feel right, and therefore I need more practice and maybe better timing or more micro dosing as you go through the run, as opposed to eating one big bar, then trying to run, then another big bar, which, you know, not everyone's going to be able to stomach and absorb correctly. So it is kind of trial and error. Everyone's different. What you read in the magazines and online may not work for you. I know that in my case, I very rarely was able to stomach a whole gel or a whole bar during a race. So my only way of doing it was literally micro dosing, right? A tiny little sip here and there. But I'd do that for 9 hours and I was absolutely fine. But if I went for, I need a gel now, I'd do a big gel, I'd have a huge spike in my blood sugar levels. My stomach was all over the place and I really struggled. So that might work for some people. Brilliant. Keep doing that. For others, if you find that, you know, you're carrying a heavy stomach once you start ingesting all this stuff, then you need to find what works for you. And now's the time to do that. 3 months pre-event is the time where you can start playing around with different solutions.
Yeah. And it is the absolute key to this is now that the long ride is now a time to be practicing fueling whilst riding steady, rather than maybe during the winter, people's approaches are different to it. But it is all now about, right from the very first 20 minutes of your long ride, taking calories on board, either in the form of liquid, in the form of gel, or the form of solids. Any of those are fine if they work for you. Experiment, find what works, and try to get what your number is. In terms of fluids, I think we can put a rough finger in the air and say roughly 500 milliliters to 750 milliliters per hour for most athletes. If it's hot, you're going to need more. And if it's really hot, you're going to need significantly more. So think about how you're going to get that sorted during training, whether that's stopping at petrol gas stations or corner shops or whatever. And you're also going to need to consider sodium, which is where we talk about, you know, Precision Fuel and Hydration came in. They were really the first company who had a really solid option for carrying sodium supplementation on the road with you, really. Most people are going to need a minimum of 1,000 milligrams of sodium per liter of fluid that they take in. So you have to have a plan for how to carry that with you. If you're out for a 6-hour ride, you're probably going to need 5 or 6 lots of sachets to go in your drinks while you're out there. So you need to practice that in training, especially if you're an athlete who struggles with cramps in the night in the calf or the foot. That's a real tell that you're not getting the sodium supplementation right. And more than that, the sodium is the thing that helps with the rehydration. It's not just the fluid going in. We need to make sure it's going in at the same concentration that it's coming out in sweat. So it is really, really important to get that right. Listeners, if you don't know what we're talking about at this point, just follow the link in the show notes to Precision Fuel and Hydration. Click on that. Tons of educational material on there that you can follow and just learn about the amount of sodium that you likely need for your body and the events you're doing and the kind of weather that you're in there.
I'm going through a really interesting process with the athletes that I coach one-to-one and through the high performance program, which is I found a difference in what the athlete thinks that they're going to consume during a long ride and what they do actually consume. So I'm asking them all to essentially have a plan A, and they think that their plan A is, call it 60 grams of carbs per hour, hour after hour. And so they say that I'm going to do that through these methods. So a gel, then a bar, then a gel, for example. And I asked them to write that pre-ride, and then I asked them to write what they actually consumed, when and where. And the two very, very rarely match. I haven't actually seen one match to date, but it's okay. We're still 3 months out from race day. So as we were saying, this is the time to play around with this. But it goes to show that what we think we can actually consume and absorb versus what we do actually is different. So maybe that's something that the athletes listening can do themselves. So within their Training Peaks or whatever platform they use, when you next go out for a long significant ride, before you go out on that ride, write down what you plan on consuming, and then after the ride, write what you actually did and see where the differences are and how you can address that. Because if you know that you've got a solid plan, but you're actually struggling to match that, then there are certain steps that you can take to make sure that come race day, you'll be able to stick to that plan A. But at the moment, from what I've seen, from the visibility that I have with the athletes, is that there's a real big difference. So even if you think you're going to consume 60 grams, you know, I'm seeing as low as 30 grams, half of what they should be having. And so 3 months out, that's not so much of an issue. Come race day, if it's not addressed in time, then we've seen it all before, where athletes are either in the portaloos or walking around with a stitch, which is not ideal and a long way from all this training that they've done in winter and in the lead up. It's such a shame that athletes aren't being able to fulfill their full potential due to essentially a lack of trial and error through nutrition.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And it's something that until athletes try, they don't know. And if they don't try till race day, really they're just putting the finger in the air at that point. So I'm on a mission really to help people understand what they need to do during the race and to practice it before the race. If we can help people stop making mistakes. I really believe the biggest one is that thing we said earlier where people talk about, I need to go out and do fasted training because I'm trying to teach my body to burn fat. Well, guess what? Your body's not a student sitting in a classroom that's going to learn how to do that. At this point, your job is now to teach it how to digest carbohydrate as you're exercising. That's your only job, kids.
Yeah, there's a lot of kind of information that might not be relevant to all the listeners on the internet. So just be a little bit wary of these different techniques when we know at the end of the day, consuming carbohydrate is the best way to get you around a multiple hour event.
Yeah. Right, then next point, let's talk about how and when to introduce brick runs into training. Let's talk about racing weekends, and let's talk about whether or not we should do 70.3s in the lead up. So the good news is for most athletes listening, you probably don't need to introduce bricks as early as you think you do. I think the last 8 weeks before event day is perfect. And the only reason to do a brick run is to teach your brain that although your legs feel horrible when you first start running, within 5 minutes, they're going to feel fine again. It's 99% psychological. And a 15-minute run off the bike for the first few weeks of this brick run process is plenty for you to go out, probably feel like you've got legs made of jelly, and then find that your legs come round again. So that's the good news. Tell yourself as you're running, my legs are going to come round again. They are going to come round. They're going to feel better in 5 minutes. And then they do. And then the next time you'll remember that that's happened. Then on race day, when your legs feel horrible coming out of transition, which they will, you can tell yourself that you've experienced this 8 times before in training and you're going to be fine. Now, we talk about gradually increasing the length of a brick run, but we don't ever do a brick run with our coached athletes longer than about 45 minutes. And we only do that a couple of very specific times. So even though it's tempting to think there are coaches and streams of coaching thought that have people do really long brick runs, I don't have any of our athletes do any of that. I don't think it's necessary, and we can get most of the benefit, or all of the benefit, with none of the injury risk by doing it a different way. So that 15 minutes through to 45 e-pace, I think is absolutely plenty, so our athletes can go in feeling comfortable and confident.
It's very, very tempting to do more, isn't it? We think that how the hell am I going to run a marathon off the back of this, but when I'm only running 15, 20 minutes. But
and I should test and see how my legs feel for 2 hours off the bike, right?
Yes, it's the balance of risk versus reward. And
yeah,
the occasional athlete are going to do crazy brick sessions, but come race day, is that beneficial? And within that training block, is it that beneficial? For the majority of athletes, the answer is no. So again, it comes down to that patience that we were talking about at the beginning of this podcast, where patience goes a very long way, and it's a very long build up to an event. So if you can just hold back, and if it says 15 minutes in your plan, don't go and do half an hour. Half an hour is not better than 15 minutes. 15 minutes is better than half an hour. And it's really hard to trust in that plan. It's really hard to trust in yourself and kind of have that confidence in your body that your legs will come around after 5 to 10 minutes, and they will. So yeah, it's psychologically, it's very hard to only see 15 minutes, especially when you're so fit. You've had a real good winter. You're in this really exciting build phase towards your big event of the year. And you think, why the hell am I running 15 minutes? I should be running 1 hour, 15 minutes. But we know that that's not the case. It shouldn't be that.
Yeah, good. Now, the 2 specific instances where we'll have people do longer runs than this, we'll have race simulation weekends. And for most athletes, they'll definitely have a race simulation weekend 2 weekends before their Ironman. So we're basically going to do most of an Ironman broken up across a weekend. We'll have a long swim on a Friday night or Saturday morning, a long ride of about 6 hours on the Saturday with a 45-minute brick run. And then 2-hour run Sunday morning. It's a big old session, big old broken Ironman there. You'll get through that if you've built up to it appropriately, and you'll feel great at the end of it, as long as you don't try and do more in the build up. Now, sometimes with an athlete, we'll also do a shorter version of that race simulation weekend 5 weeks before race day as well. Ideally, we'll have an athlete race a 70.3 5 weeks out. If they're not going to do a 70.3 5 weeks out, we'll have them do that second short race simulation weekend. But I'm a really big fan of people having that 70.3. Firstly, I think the fatigue level is roughly similar that comes from that and the race sim. I think it's probably more fatiguing to race just because of all the emotional components as well. But you get a really nice bounce back in fitness after a week or two after that 70.3. And in a small number of cases, if their 70.3 is much further out than 5 weeks, we might have them do a 70.3 and 2 race simulation weekends, especially if there are some of our stronger athletes. But for the vast majority, it's going to be an either or situation of a 70.3 or an early semi race sim weekend.
I don't know if you've had this question a few times, Rob, but I think the listeners might appreciate the answer to it. When you talk about the 70.3 in the lead up to an Ironman, are you expecting them to do this 70.3 at Ironman pace as race simulation, or would you rather go and see this athlete essentially do a 70.3 to do a 70.3?
It's a race. Yeah, they're going to go out there and they're going to race it.
Yeah.
And it's a really great opportunity to see where the fitness is at that point. They won't prepare for it in a specific way like we'll prepare them for if they were doing a 70.3, but they're often very, very surprised at how well they go off in inverted commas, like no specific 70.3 training. But of course, it allows them to see this tremendous fitness they've built up, even if they don't feel they've done the usual sharpening sessions and the specific pace runs that they would need for 70.3. Often they have some of their best races at 70.3 at that point. So it's a real good sort of mini peak and then a week's recovery after it. And then 2 really solid weeks of training leading up to the big racing weekend, and then 2 weeks of taper to race day. It's usually a really good confidence boost for the athletes.
Yeah, I think what you said on the kind of exaggerated stress and all that that an event brings is what you should kind of be running towards as an athlete. And you know, we all find race day really stressful, especially when it's a big A race. So if you can go through those steps and processes in a B race, inverted commas, then that is definitely going to help you come race day. So, you know, if you're put off by, oh God, I'm a bit scared of doing a 70.3 because you have to go through all the faff and the stress and travel and put my bike back together and all that. That's exactly why you should be doing it. Because if you care about your A race, and if we're talking about long distance triathlon, you're going to have to go through that process 5 or 6 weeks or 2 weeks, depending on what you're doing. So go through that process. It's not just physical training that we're trying to get you ready for. It's also, we want you on the start line totally prepared and knowing that you've done everything you can up to that point. And that also includes logistical travel, putting your bike together, repairing punctures, all that other little stuff that, you know, like recovery, we kind of put in this little box that we only open every so often. But if you can really approach your kind of Ironman build up holistically and look at everything, then the likelihood is you're going to have a much more successful day come race day.
And the biggest thing I think about doing a race 5 weeks out is it allows you to possibly make mistakes that you don't want to make on race day. And the mistakes are usually of the athlete's own making. And they're usually in the first hour and a half of the bike because they feel absolutely magic and they end up not pacing the way that they mean to. I'd much rather an athlete makes that mistake. Every time someone comes past them, they accelerate. Every time they pass somebody, they accelerate. I'd much rather they get back and, you know, they look at the power file and go, oh, do you know what? I was 10% higher or 5% higher than I meant to be in that section. You probably get away with that in a 70.3. Definitely won't get away with it in an Ironman. So it's a real sort of insight into your own athletic personality at that point.
Totally. And I always say to my athletes, and this is maybe something that the listeners can take away, is as a coach, I always look at the last kind of quarter of each section of their race. So in the bike, I only look at their last hour, let's say if it's an Ironman, or in the run, I look at their last 10K. And I don't look at the rest. I can make my kind of judgment on how they pace their race just from those 2 elements. Because if you're running hard and well in those last 10K, the probability is that you paced it really well, and everyone else around you is walking, and you're running strong to the line. Same in the bike. If you're really smooth in that last hour of the ride, the likelihood is you're going to run well, and I can see that later on the run. So try and think about those two sections of your race, and you can go through that process in your 70.3 or your race sim weekend, that all you're trying to do is set up the last portion of each element of your race, and if you get those bits right, the probability is you got the first bit right.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Right, let's talk about our next tips then for swimming, the transition to open water swimming and open water skills training, and when we should do that. I think the first thing we have to flag to people here is it's very dependent on the actual physical time of year in the calendar, how early it is in the springtime, because there's only so much swimming that you can do in really cold water before you have to get out. So there's this caveat of, ideally, we would like you to get 4 to 6 swims in open water in before your race day. That's going to be down to whether you can physically do that in the place where you live in reality. I think if you can get definitely 6 and, well, definitely 4, potentially 6 long open water swims in, you're in a really good position then to be really comfortable and confident in your open water swimming and having translated your in the pool training into open water by the time race day comes around.
And how do you advise an athlete to go through that decision making? Do you go on temperature? Is there in your mind a kind of temperature gauge that an athlete can check online, and if it's over X amount, it's okay to go and swim?
Yeah, I think 15 degrees is about the point where people are not going to feel cold.
Yeah.
I think between 15 and 12 is the point where when you get in, you're going to have to go through considerable, it's like it's 2 swim hats on, it's considerable putting your face in the water and lifting your face out again and really taking, 2 to 5 minutes to get used to it. 12, I think, is around the area where British Triathlon say, look, you can't do a 70.3 distance. We have to start cutting things short at that point. And the reason is it's that temperature where you get out. 12 sounds a lot, but it feels like ice water. Let's not mess about here. You get out and your feet feel like frozen blocks and your hands feel like frozen blocks. 15 still feels pretty fresh, but you're getting out and you don't have, that feeling of not feeling your hands and feet anymore. And I think anywhere above 15, you're okay. 18 plus, you're good with a wetsuit on for sure.
Yeah, I think it is worth the athletes checking online, and usually, your lake will be able to publicize the temperature in the water. So yeah, keep that in mind.
Yeah. I got in this weekend in the sea, down in Anglesey in the old swimming trunks, and there's no way I could have swum face in front crawl in it. It felt as cold as my ice barrel in the back garden does at the moment. Now, I'm sure it wasn't, but it was a real test of endurance to just be in for 2 minutes, let alone face in. And that's, to give it context, we're recording in the middle of April. So pretty fresh for anyone looking to swim in North Wales at the moment.
Yeah, be careful with that.
All right, then, gear and equipment testing and checking. So we've already talked quite a bit, I think, about athletes transitioning over onto their TT bikes or their road bikes with TT bars. Get on those bikes in those positions as much as you can in the final 12 weeks. And ideally, as soon as you've acclimated to your aero position or your clip-on bars and your road bike position, use those all the time from now on. Test the race kit, test the outfit that you're going to be riding in, and have a think about what you're going to do clothing-wise if it rains on race day. There's a tendency these days, I think, because Zwift is so good and indoor training stuff is so good, and it's really been the last 3 or 4 years this has happened. It's almost become the default to ride indoors all the time unless the weather's perfect. And I can understand that, but we have to sort of have this idea of, if we never train in the rain and it rains on race day, what are we going to experience? How are we going to know how to dress? I'd really encourage people to go out and do some training in the rain, especially if you're riding one of the classic British Ironman courses where the chances are it's rained every year I've ever been there. So there's some things there you need to take care of and can take care of easily.
Yeah, I'd approach this with real positivity from an athlete's point of view. This is like the really exciting time in training. You've got all this fitness that you've built indoors, and now's the time to go and express it outdoors, go and explore, go on the roads that either so it's perfectly safe, or if you're confident enough, go and explore some new roads. And to me, this is the beauty of the sport. It's you've got an engine that can carry you a very, very long way, and it's part of your training. So go out there and yeah, get away from the screen when possible, and experience the great outdoors and keep it safe. And if you do so, I think it can add a huge amount to our training and to our week. It's quite invigorating.
Yeah. And another shout out to the Garmin Varia, the radar and light system. I know a lot of our athletes have bought them over the last few weeks after our recommendations, but if you haven't seen them yet, it's a really nifty, we should be sponsored by them really, Chris. Really nifty situation that tells you on your Garmin Hen unit when cars are coming up behind you and beeps at you to let you know they're coming, and even warns you if they're going really quickly. Every ride, I reckon, since I've had it, my Garmin's given me a warning of something I wouldn't have noticed was coming. And it allows me to feel much, much safer and know what's going on behind me. So really recommended for people.
Yeah.
Right. Next segue then for athletes in the last 12 weeks. Let's talk about course familiarization for big races. 3 little points we want to give to people here. The best thing you can do is get yourself to the course and ride the course ahead of time. We recognize that everyone's going to be able to do that. So at least look at the course maps and have a picture in your head of where they're going to go. If you want to go on Google Maps as well and have a look at those things, get a feel for what the area and what it looks like. And even if you can check out some YouTube videos, I think that's not a bad idea in this day and age as well. Get a feel for what the course actually looks like. But getting to the venue and getting a feel for what it looks like can take so much pressure off you if you possibly can before race day. I think it's a real bonus for the athlete.
Yeah, massively. And if there are kind of technical elements of the course, so we're in the UK and we know Ironman Wales and Ironman Bolton, there are some technical elements on the bike, and just because it's not mountain bike single track doesn't mean it's not technical. If you're trying to ride them as fast and as smooth as possible on a TT bike, then knowing what's around that corner and the surface and all those little elements, it gets rid of a huge amount of stress, which usually means you're far more relaxed, and you can approach the technical elements far more comfortably, and that's going to lead to a quicker time and a more pleasurable experience. So yeah, I remember I did Ironman Bolton and Wales, and I didn't recce Bolton and I did recce Wales, and the difference in experience was vast, and the courses aren't too dissimilar. And looking back, if I could rewind the clock, I would have definitely done a recce on Bolton, because it really, really does help.
And the other part of this is knowing how far you've got to go on race day can be so helpful mentally, because it's a very long way, 112 miles. 80 miles is a very long way on a bike, and you've still got over 30 miles to go at that point. So it can feel like a really long way. All of the major Ironmans in the UK, Wales, Outlaw, and Cork, they all have unique road surfaces. They all have unique handling challenges, let's put. I think it's a massive, massive benefit for athletes to know that's coming. How many times have we heard people at the Outlaw come back and say, I thought I'd gone the wrong way on that last section where it comes through the hall and there's the terribly, horribly potholed road there. That's only there, isn't it? Because the organisers can't find another way to get people back into the National Water Sports Centre. There's no way they'd ideally want it going on that road. I've heard the race organisers say that loads of times. It's a terrible road surface. And if someone tried to go down that in the TT bars, they'd be in serious trouble. So it's real benefit for the athletes knowing what's coming.
Yeah, totally.
And that brings us to our last point, which is to talk about the taper. Now, we'll go into this more detail in a future episode, and I think we'll actually do a full episode just on tapering. But people always ask us this. There's a great old line in a Mark Allen and Dave Scott book that the taper should be between 4 and 6 weeks long. And I hear that trotted out every year in Facebook groups when I'm reading stuff. And yeah, it does need to be 4 to 6 weeks long if you're Mark Allen and Dave Scott and you've been training for 50 hours a week and you've got one main Ironman of the year. But for meal mortals, 2 weeks is the time we're going to be tapering for. So after that big race sim weekend, we're going to have a couple of days of rest, and then we're going to have 2 weeks of only doing enough training to stop you going completely insane. Expect to feel pretty not good during that taper time, both mentally and physically. until about the Wednesday or Thursday before race day when you'll start to feel good. But if people in their heads have that last 2 weeks before race day as being I'm not doing much apart from trying to shed loads of fatigue during that phase, I think that's all they need to know about that for now.
Shed fatigue and avoid being stale. They're kind of the two metrics that I think athletes could have in the back of their minds. And it's amazing that everyone loses all their fitness in taper week, isn't it? The amount of emails that we get of everything's gone wrong, I feel so unfit and I've got 5 days to go to my Ironman.
And I've got fat.
Yeah, I've got fat, lazy, and I can't pace my run anymore. It's not the case. These are just the mind games that happen.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think having a whole episode to tapering is a good idea.
Well, we'll definitely do that in, I don't know, we'll do it in 4 to 6 weeks' time as we approach the European race season. We'll put that out for people. But yeah, I think that gives a good overview of the last 3 months before Ironman at that point, Chris, doesn't it? Is there anything you want to add at that point? Anything we've not covered?
No, I think if there's a takeaway, just one major point would be to not panic and not stress at this point. You're far enough to be making good positive changes within your training and the aspects that you do around it, but don't be looking to do more at this point unless your plan is progressively increasing, which is absolutely fine. But kind of avoid all panic training at this point and believe in the process that you're going through. You're already fit if you got to this point and you followed a plan. So now it's just refining it and making it really race specific to your needs. Aside from that, don't be throwing in a random marathon or ultra marathon or all these, crazy events that we try and slot in because we think that we need to. You don't need to be running a marathon before an Ironman, for example. So yeah, keep calm and keep training and recovering.
You can make massive fitness gains in 12 weeks. Yeah. It's all about getting out of the way of the traps that sit out there for people that tell them they've got to compulsively try and do more, avoid anything that might give you illness or injury, and follow that progressive plan through to race day. I think that just about sums it up, doesn't it?
Yeah, bang on. Thanks, Rob.
Good stuff. So that brings us to the end of this week's episode. So just to remind you, over at precisionfuelandhydration.com, you can use the code OA23 for 15% off your first electrolyte order. And if you're looking for help with your endurance, triathlon, Ironman, running, ultra running, marathon, swim, run, you name it, any kind of endurance training, at teamoxygenaddict.com, I think we've got the most comprehensive endurance sports coaching program for busy age groupers. If you want to find out more, whether you'd be a good fit for us, for the team, and whether we can help you out, book a call with us. There's a link in the show notes that goes straight through to our calendar, and we can spend 30 minutes finding out how we can best help you reach your endurance event goals in 2023. So there's links in the show notes. You don't have to remember them. Until next week, he's Coach Chris Pelfreyman, and I'm Coach Rob Wilby, and you've been listening to the Oxygen Addict Podcast.